The cathedral had not held a Sunday Mass in 11 years, but tonight its bones were put to a different kind of use. 40 feet below the cracked altar, in a vault carved out of Palermo's old sewage tunnels, 12 men in black suits sat in a circle of candlelight. They were not here to pray. They were here to watch a wedding. Zephyrin Moretti stood at the center of the vault in a suit that fit him the way a coffin fits a body. Exact, final, unwanted. He was 34 years old and had buried more men than he could name, but nothing had ever made his jaw tighten the way tonight did. Because tonight, he was not burying anyone. Tonight, he was getting married to a woman he had met exactly once. The law is the law. Old Don Ferrante had told him 3 days earlier, tapping a cane against the marble floor of the council chamber. A boss who is not bound cannot be trusted. Marry Zephyrin or step aside for someone who will. So here she was, Callisthea Reyes, 28 years old, soft-spoken, with tired eyes, and a body the council men had already started whispering about. Too big, too plain, not the kind of woman a boss like Zephyrin should have on his arm. She was the sister of Evander, his missing second-in-command, and that connection was the only reason the council had approved the match. A pity marriage, they called it behind closed doors. A cage with a woman's face on it. Callisthea did not look like a woman walking into a cage. She looked like a woman walking into a job interview she was trying very hard not to fail. Her hands trembled slightly as she stepped forward in a borrowed white dress that had been altered twice and still didn't sit right at the shoulders. She kept her eyes down. She let her shoulders curl inward, the way she'd practiced in the mirror for 2 weeks. Small, harmless, forgettable. It was, she knew, the best performance of her life. The old priest, defrocked, paid in cash, and unwilling to ask questions, mumbled through vows neither of them meant. Zephyrin's voice was flat when he said his lines. Callisthea's voice shook, and every man in that vault mistook the shaking for fear. None of them clocked that her pulse was steady as stone. "You may exchange rings," the priest said. Zephyrin took her hand. His grip was gentle, surprisingly so, for a man whose hands had done what his had done. He slid a ring onto her finger, plain gold, nothing showy. A political ring for a political wife. Then it was her turn. Callisthea lifted his hand and slid a ring onto his finger, and in the half-second her thumb pressed against the underside of his knuckle, something inside her own ring clicked to life. A biometric scanner no thicker than a contact lens hidden in the band's inner curve, sitting flush against her palm. It was reading his fingerprint, and through the fingerprint, unlocking a mirrored connection to the phone in his breast pocket. She kept her eyes down. She let her lip tremble, right on cue. Nobody in that vault was looking at her hands. They were looking at her face, cataloging her as weak, soft, no threat at all, exactly the mistake she needed them to make. Behind her ribs, her heart was not doing the fluttering, anxious thing her face performed. It was counting seconds, 45 more, 40, 35. The scanner needed 90 uninterrupted seconds of contact to clone the phone's file directory, and a wedding kiss was the only excuse in the world to hold a stranger's hand that long without suspicion. You may kiss the bride. Zephyrin hesitated. It was the first genuinely human thing she'd seen him do all night. A flicker of something almost like guilt, gone as fast as it appeared. Then he leaned down and kissed her, brief and correct, his hand still folded over hers. 60, 70, 80. The download bar in the scanner's memory, invisible, silent, buried under 3 layers of fake wedding ring engraving, hit 100% exactly as he pulled away. Callisthea exhaled, like a woman who had just survived something terrifying. It wasn't a lie, technically. She had. The councilmen clapped. Don Ferrante raised a glass of wine that tasted like nothing to anyone in that room. Zephyrin's men murmured their congratulations to their boss and looked at his new bride the way people look at furniture. Present, necessary, invisible. Zephyrin looked at her exactly once more before the crowd swallowed them both. It was brief, assessing, the look of a man doing the math on a woman he now legally owned and understood not at all. Callisthea let him look. She let herself be small in his eyes, let herself be the timid, overlooked girl the whole council had decided she was the moment they saw her. She had learned a long time ago that being underestimated was not a weakness. It was the sharpest weapon she owned. Somewhere in this city, or 100 miles from it, her brother Evander was missing. 3 months gone. No body, no ransom, nothing but silence. And every man in this vault believed the boss she'd just married held the answer. She intended to find out if that was true. The ring on her finger was warm against her skin, humming faintly with the weight of everything it had just stolen. Tonight, she thought, smiling the shy, grateful smile of a woman who had married into safety. The real wedding begins. Not the one with vows. The one with secrets. The lighthouse hadn't guided a ship in 30 years, but it still knew how to hide people. Callisthea climbed the spiral stairs 2 at a time, boots silent on stone, worn smooth by decades of storms, until she reached the small round room at the top where the old lamp mechanism used to turn. Now it held a folding table, 3 laptops, and a man named Marcus Cade, who looked up from a bank of monitors the second her hand touched the door. "You're late," he said. "I was getting married." She pulled off the cardigan she'd worn to blend into the coastal road traffic and dropped into the chair across from him. Her spine straightened. Her shoulders squared. The soft, folded-in posture she'd worn for 2 weeks fell away like a coat she was done wearing for the day. "Forgive me if the timeline was tight." Cade almost smiled. Almost. He'd run field agents for 11 years, and Callisthea Reyes was, without question, the best one he'd ever handed a cover story to. Nobody who met Mrs. Moretti would ever guess she'd graduated top of her class in tactical infiltration, or that she could put a man on the ground with her bare hands faster than most of Cade's male agents could draw a weapon. "Data transfer confirmed?" he asked. She set her phone on the table and tapped it awake. A mirrored file directory bloomed across the screen. Everything on Zephyrin Moretti's phone cloned the moment her ring had finished its 90-second read. Messages, financial ledgers, encrypted folders she hadn't cracked yet. "Full directory," she said. "Give me an hour, and I'll have decryption running on the rest." This was the job. This was the only reason Callisthea Reyes existed inside that vault tonight as a trembling, overlooked bride. 6 months ago, her brother Evander, Zephyrin's most trusted lieutenant, had vanished without a trace. No ransom note, no body, no sign the Moretti family had even looked for him. The official bureau file said the obvious thing. A Mafia enforcer had probably crossed his own boss and paid the price for it. Buried somewhere in the hills outside Palermo, one more name in an unmarked grave. Callisthea had never believed it. Evander didn't cross people. He was careful, methodical, the kind of man who color-coded his contingency plans. If he'd disappeared, someone had taken him, and the man most likely to have done it, on paper, was Zephyrin Moretti. So she'd gone to Cade with a plan nobody at the Bureau wanted to approve: infiltrate the Moretti family from the inside, using the one connection no background check could fake. She really was Evander's sister, and the council really did need Zephyrin married. She'd spent 3 months building the quiet, socially anxious sister persona before the council ever proposed the match, feeding just enough information through back channels to make sure Zephyrin's people suggested her name themselves. It had worked. That was the part that scared her a little. People believed what they wanted to believe, and everyone had wanted to believe a heavy-set, timid woman posed no threat at all. "Start with the financials," Cade said. "If Moretti's dirty, it'll be in the money." She pulled up the ledger folder and began scrolling. Numbered accounts, shell companies, standard Mafia bookkeeping, ugly but unremarkable, until she hit a line item that made her stop scrolling entirely. A recurring transfer, weekly, for the past 3 months. Routed through 4 shell accounts before landing somewhere she couldn't trace yet, but the amount alone was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of euros, bleeding out of Zephyrin's personal accounts on a schedule that started the exact week Evander disappeared. "Cade, look at this." He leaned over her shoulder, frowning at the numbers. "Ransom payments? No demand ever came in. No proof of life was ever sent." She traced the pattern with her finger, thinking out loud, the way she always did when the pieces weren't fitting the shape she expected. "This isn't a man paying off a debt. Look at the destination accounts. They're rotating. Cayman, then Malta, then back through Zurich. That's not extortion. That's someone funding an active search." Cade straightened. "You think he's looking for Evander?" "I think," Callisthea said slowly, feeling the ground shift under a plan she'd built her entire cover around, "that Zephyrin Moretti has spent close to 4 million euros in the last 3 months trying to find my brother himself. It didn't fit. Nothing about it fit. If Zephyrin had ordered the hit, why would he be burning through a fortune chasing down a man he already knew was gone? Unless the official story, the one even the Bureau had accepted without much scrutiny, was wrong from the start." Cade rubbed a hand over his jaw, the way he did when a case stopped being simple. "Could be misdirection. A smart boss covers his tracks by looking like he's grieving. Maybe. She didn't believe it, though, and she could tell by the careful way Cade said it that he didn't fully believe it either. But that's a lot of money to spend on a performance nobody outside his own private ledger was ever going to see. She closed the laptop halfway, staring at the dark reflection of her own face in the screen. Somewhere in this equation, the story she'd walked into that vault believing, the Mafia boss who disappeared my brother, had just developed a crack straight down the middle. "I need more time inside," she said. "Real access, not wedding night access." Cade studied her for a long moment. "You're supposed to be the frightened wife nobody looks twice at." "I am the frightened wife nobody looks twice at." She stood, pulling the cardigan back over her shoulders, letting her spine curve, her chin drop, watching the sharp, focused woman in the room fold herself back into someone soft and small and safe to underestimate. "That's exactly why it's going to work." She was at the door before Cade spoke again. "Callisthea." He waited until she looked back. "If he's not the one who took your brother, that means somebody else is still out there, somebody who's been quiet enough that even Moretti hasn't found them." She held the thought like a stone in her chest the whole way down the spiral stairs, back out into the cold Portofino night, back toward the man she'd married, for a lie that was already starting to unravel. Zephyrin's penthouse in Milan took up the entire top floor of a building with no name on the door, and Callisthea had spent 10 nights inside it, learning its silences the way other wives might learn a husband's moods. She knew which floorboards near the kitchen creaked. She knew the housekeeper left at 9 and the 2 guards downstairs rotated at midnight, leaving a 6-minute gap while the new shift signed in. She knew Zephyrin worked late in his study most nights, door closed, lamp burning until well past 2. Except tonight, when he'd left for a council meeting across the city and told her, almost gently, that he'd be back by morning. 6 minutes. That was all the gap ever gave her, and she'd learned to move inside it, like water finding a crack. The study door was locked, but the lock was decorative more than functional, the kind of thing installed for a man who trusted the walls around it more than the door itself. Callisthea had it open in under a minute, and she was inside before her own pulse had time to climb. The room smelled like cedar and old paper. Bookshelves lined 2 walls, floor to ceiling, and a heavy oak desk sat beneath the window, its surface bare except for a lamp and a single framed photograph she hadn't let herself look at closely yet. She didn't have time for the photograph. She had 6 minutes, minus the 90 seconds already spent getting in. She started with the desk. Locked drawers, all 3 of them, and she was reaching for the pick set folded into the seam of her sleeve when her eyes caught the bookshelf instead. One section, low and half hidden behind a reading chair, where the spines didn't quite sit flush with the others. A gap. A seam. Her fingers found the catch behind a false row of law books, and the shelf swung outward on a hinge, quiet enough that someone had oiled it recently. Behind it, a small steel lockbox, unmarked, tucked into a recess built for exactly that size and shape. Her hands were steady when she lifted it out. They were not steady when she opened it. Evander's watch. The one their mother had given him at his university graduation, the one he never took off, and he hadn't been wearing it in any photo the Bureau had gathered since his disappearance, because Callisthea now understood with sudden, sick clarity that someone had taken it from him. A folded piece of paper beneath it, edges soft from handling, covered in her brother's handwriting, fragments, half-sentences, dates that meant nothing to her yet, and beneath that, a photograph of Evander himself, taken recently, taken alive, thinner than she remembered, sitting in a room she didn't recognize, with no visible restraints and an expression she couldn't read. Her breath left her all at once. She had spent 3 months building a lie so complete she sometimes forgot which parts of her were real, and none of that training had prepared her for the plain, physical fact of her brother's watch sitting in her palm. That doesn't belong to you. She didn't hear him come in. That was the first terrifying thing. The second was the tone of his voice. Not fury, not the cold violence she'd braced 11 nights running for. Something quieter, something almost tired. Zephyrin stood in the doorway, in the same suit he'd left in, jacket unbuttoned, watching her kneel on his study floor with his most private box open in her lap. She should have had a story ready. She had 6 different lies rehearsed for exactly this scenario, and every one of them evaporated the second she looked up and saw his face wasn't angry at all. It was grieving. "I know it doesn't," she said, because lying felt suddenly, uselessly small. "It's my brother's. I know whose it is." He crossed the room slowly, and she braced herself. For the shout, for the hand closing around her wrist, for whatever came next, in a house that belonged entirely to a man she'd married 3 months into a lie. Instead, he crouched down across from her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. Exhaustion that had nothing to do with tonight's council meeting, and everything to do with something much older. "I've been looking for him since the week he vanished," Zephyrin said. "Longer than that, since before you and I ever stood in front of that priest. Then why does everyone believe you had him finished? Because it's a story the council likes better than the truth." He reached past her, into the recess behind the shelf, and pulled out something she hadn't seen tucked into the back corner. A flash drive, small and unmarked, on a thin silver chain. This was in his apartment, hidden in the lining of a jacket, in a place only someone who grew up with him would think to look. It took me 2 months to find it. He held it out to her. Not withheld, not leveraged. Offered. Her hand shook taking it, and this time the shaking wasn't a performance. "There's a message on it," Zephyrin said, "encrypted, but I broke it eventually. I was going to show you eventually. I just hadn't decided how." She plugged it into her phone with fingers that didn't feel entirely like her own, and the file opened on a single line of text, time-stamped 6 days before Evander vanished, written in the private shorthand only the two of them had ever used. A rogue faction inside the syndicate grabbed me. "Don't trust the council. Don't trust anyone above Ferrante's rank. Tell no one, especially not Zephyrin, until you're sure." Callisthea read it twice. Then she looked up at the man kneeling across from her, the man she'd married to destroy, the man whose own encrypted message had just told her, in her brother's handwriting, that he might be the one person in this entire war who hadn't betrayed anyone. "You've read this," she said quietly. "Every word." Zephyrin's jaw tightened, "which means I know exactly what you are, Callisthea. And I know exactly who's really been hunting your brother, and it isn't me." Zephyrin called it an anniversary trip, which made Callisthea laugh for the first time in weeks. A short, disbelieving sound, because they'd been married 11 days shy of a month, and there was nothing to celebrate except the fact that neither of them had ended the other yet. 3 months, he corrected, watching her reaction from across the car. "The council likes anniversaries, gives them something to gossip about besides business." She understood, without either of them saying it plainly, that the trip was cover for something else. Since the night in his study, an uneasy quiet had settled between them. Not trust, not yet, but a shared understanding that they were both circling the same enemy from different directions. He hadn't told her everything. She hadn't told him everything either. But the flash drive sat in a locked drawer in her room now, instead of hidden behind his bookshelf, and that alone was a kind of truce. The Genoa cargo terminal at dusk was a maze of stacked containers and cranes frozen mid-lift, fog rolling in off the water, thick enough to swallow the floodlights whole. Zephyrin's convoy, 2 black SUVs, 4 of his men, and a driver who'd worked for the family longer than Callisthea had been alive, moved through the container rows toward a private berth where a shipment was supposedly waiting. Callisthea knew, within 30 seconds of stepping out of the car, that something was wrong. It was nothing she could have explained to a stranger. It was the wrongness of a place too quiet for its size, the absence of the ordinary noise a working terminal should have, even at this hour. No forklifts, no radio chatter, no dock workers finishing a shift. Her training screamed it before her conscious mind caught up. "This is a kill box. Zephyrin." She kept her voice low, urgent. "Nobody's here. This should be a working shift." He'd already gone still beside her, one hand drifting toward his jacket. "Get back in the..." The first shot took the driver before he finished the sentence. What happened next took less than 90 seconds, though Callisthea would replay it in far slower detail for months afterward. Muzzle flashes bloomed from 3 separate container stacks, a coordinated triangle, professional, meant to collapse the convoy from all sides at once. Zephyrin's men returned fire and dropped for cover, but 2 were down within the first 10 seconds, and the shooters had the higher ground. Callisthea did not think. That was the thing about training this deep. It didn't live in the part of the brain that debated. Her body simply moved, and the timid, soft-spoken wife, who'd spent 3 months curling her shoulders inward, vanished completely, replaced by someone Zephyrin had never once seen. She dropped low, rolled behind a shipping container, and came up with a fallen guard's sidearm in her hand before Zephyrin had even processed that she was no longer standing beside him. 2 shots, precise, and the gunman on the nearest stack folded backward off the ledge. She was moving again before his body hit the ground, flanking wide, reading the angles the way she'd been trained to read a room full of threats, putting herself between the second shooter's line of fire and Zephyrin's exposed side without breaking stride. "Down," she shouted, and he obeyed on instinct, dropping just as a round splintered the crate behind where his head had been a half-second earlier. She disarmed the second gunman hand to hand, a brutal, efficient sequence of movements that ended with the man on the ground and his weapon in her grip before he'd finished registering that the boss's soft, harmless wife had just broken his wrist. The third shooter broke and ran rather than face whatever she was, and 2 of Zephyrin's remaining men brought him down at the tree line. Silence rolled back in, over the fog, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors and the distant hush of water against the pier. Callisthea stood in the wreckage of it. 2 guards finished, 1 wounded, 3 attackers down, breathing hard, weapons still raised, every soft edge of the persona she'd spent 3 months perfecting, stripped completely away. And Zephyrin was staring at her, not with fear, not exactly with suspicion either, though there was plenty of that mixed in. Mostly, she realized with a jolt, he was staring at her the way a man stares at a puzzle that has just rearranged itself into a picture he never expected. "Who?" he said slowly, lowering his own weapon. "Are you?" She didn't answer right away. There was no soft lie left to reach for. The shaking hands, the trembling voice, the shy downward glance that had fooled a room full of dangerous men for 3 straight months. All of it was gone, burned off in 90 seconds of gunfire, and what stood in its place was simply herself. "Not who you think," she said finally, lowering the weapon but not her guard. "But not your enemy either. Not tonight." Zephyrin's eyes moved over her, the stance, the grip, the calm efficiency of someone who had clearly done this before, many times, somewhere far from council chambers and cathedral vaults. Whatever conclusions he was drawing, he kept them behind his face for now. "That was a professional hit," he said instead, scanning the fog-heavy dark beyond the containers. "Coordinated, triangulated positions, synchronized timing. That's not a rival family's usual sloppiness." "No," Callisthea agreed, crouching to check the pulse of the man she'd disarmed, already unconscious, already useless for questioning until they got him somewhere secure. "It's the council's." She hadn't meant to say it aloud, not yet, not before she had proof, but the words were out, and Zephyrin's expression sharpened into something cold and focused. "Say that again. The formations, the equipment, the exfil timing. I've seen it before." She stood, wiping her hands on her ruined coat, meeting his eyes without flinching for the first time since their wedding night. This wasn't a rival mob family looking to wipe out your line, Zephyrin. This was an inside job. "Somebody on your own council just tried to have you finished, and I think they wanted your new wife gone right along with you." The safe house suite in Turin belonged to no one on paper, a bulletproof shell rented under 4 layers of false companies, the kind of place Zephyrin kept scattered across half of Italy for exactly the nights when trust in anyone else ran out. He locked the door behind them himself, twice. Callisthea sat on the edge of the bed, still in her ruined coat, watching him pace the length of the room with something small and metallic turning over and over in his fingers. "You dropped this," he said, "during the fight." He held it up. A high-tech earpiece, no bigger than a grain of rice, pulled from the lining of her coat, where it must have shaken loose in the scramble at the docks. Standard federal issue, encrypted frequency, the kind of hardware that didn't exist in any catalog a civilian could order from. Callisthea didn't reach for it. There was no point. I know what that is, Zephyrin said quietly. I've spent enough years bribing men who carry them to recognize one on sight. The silence stretched. Somewhere below them, Turin's night traffic hummed on, indifferent to the two people standing at the exact center of a lie about to collapse. My name is Callisthea Reyes, she said finally. That part was never a lie. Everything else, the shaking hands, the quiet voice, the frightened girl who married you because the council told her to, that was a job. Zephyrin's face didn't move. He set the earpiece down on the desk with exaggerated care, as though the gentleness of the motion could keep the rest of him from breaking apart. FBI? Task force. Off the books enough that most of the Bureau doesn't know it exists. She made herself keep going, made herself say the rest, before the fear could catch up to her voice, the way it hadn't at the docks. Evander is my brother. When he disappeared, I built this cover from nothing, 3 months of planted rumors and careful positioning, just to make sure your council suggested my name themselves. I married you to get inside your family and find out what happened to him. Because you thought I killed him. Because everyone I trusted told me you did. She held his gaze, steady now, no performance left to hide behind. I was wrong. I know that now. I think I've known it since the night you handed me that flash drive, instead of throwing me out of your house. Zephyrin turned away from her, toward the window. City lights smeared gold through rain-streaked glass. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something rougher than anger. You want to know who did finished him, or who took him? Fine. I'll tell you the truth, since apparently we're both done lying tonight. He faced her again. 6 months ago, Evander came to me. He'd found something in the council's shipping ledgers. Money moving through accounts that shouldn't exist, skimmed off the top of every operation my family runs, funneled straight into the pockets of 3 senior council members, Ferrante's circle. Men who've sat at that table since before I was born. He was building a case against them. He was building evidence to bring to me, so I could bring it to the full council and force a reckoning. Zephyrin's jaw tightened. Instead, somebody found out what he was doing before he finished. He vanished 9 days later, and within a week, whispers started circulating that I'd ordered it myself, that Evander had crossed me and paid for it. A story that conveniently protected the actual traitors, and made me look guilty enough that no one questioned it too hard. He said it flatly, the exhaustion of months finally showing through the practiced calm he wore like armor. I've spent every spare euro and every favor I have left trying to find him, not to silence him, to save him, and to prove I never gave the order that took him. Callisthea sat with that for a long moment, turning it over against everything she'd learned since the wedding. The ransom-shaped payments with no ransom demand, the lockbox hidden behind his bookshelf, the ambush at the docks with its council-trained precision. The docks, she said slowly. You said it was a rival family, looking to end your line. That was the story I fed my own men, because I didn't know yet who I could trust inside my own house. His eyes flicked to her, something almost rueful in it. Turns out that included my wife. Turns out it included both of us. She stood, closing the distance between them until there was nothing left to hide behind. No ring's hidden scanner, no earpiece, no soft downward gaze. Evander's message said not to trust anyone above Ferrante's rank, not even you, until I was sure. I think I'm sure now. Zephyrin studied her the way he had at the docks, like a puzzle rearranging itself. Except this time, there was no fear buried in it. So what happens now, Agent Reyes? You call your handlers, tell them the Mafia boss they've been building a case against for 3 months is innocent. Now, she said, we stop working against each other and start working together. Your resources, my training, whatever's left of your council's patience before they realized their hit at the docks failed. She held out her hand. Not for a ring this time, not for a performance. We find my brother, and then we find out exactly which of your council members ordered a professional hit on their own boss's wedding. Zephyrin looked at her offered hand for a long moment before he took it, his grip firm, no longer gentle in the careful, political way it had been the night of their vows. Something steadier now, something that felt, for the first time, like an actual alliance instead of a cage. Truce, he said. Truce, she echoed. For now. The federal field office in Rome smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air, and Callisthea had never hated a familiar smell so much in her life. Cade was waiting in the same windowless room they always used for off-book briefings, a manila folder squared precisely in front of him, which meant whatever was inside it, he'd already decided how he wanted the conversation to go before she walked in. You've gone quiet on comms for 11 days, he said, without looking up. Then I get a burst transmission telling me Moretti didn't order the hit on your brother. Walk me through that. She did. The shipping ledgers, the skimmed accounts, the 3 council members funneling money out of every operation the family ran, the flash drive with Evander's own handwriting, warning her not to trust anyone above Ferrante's rank. She left out exactly how much of it she now believed, because some instinct told her Cade wasn't going to receive it the way she needed him to. She was right. None of that is verified, Cade said, sliding the folder across the table without opening it. What is verified is that we have a live opportunity we've been waiting 3 months for. You're inside Moretti's house. You're inside his convoy, his safe houses, his private study. This is the closest this task force has ever gotten to shutting down the Moretti family's entire operation in one move. He's not the target. He never was the target. He's the Bureau's target. Callisthea, whether or not you've decided he's redeemed himself. Cade finally opened the folder and turned it toward her. Photographs, transit routes, a floor plan of the exact garage where Zephyrin's car was serviced twice a week. We want you to plant a package. Fentanyl analog, cut for street distribution, hidden in the wheel well of his vehicle. Enough weight to guarantee a federal trafficking charge that puts him away for the rest of his life. Clean case, no courtroom drama, no need to prove crime or racketeering that a good lawyer could pick apart for years. The air in the room went very still. "And Evander?" she asked quietly. Cade's expression didn't change, and that was the answer before he even said the words out loud. If he's alive, this doesn't change the timeline for finding him. If he's not, this closes the file either way. This is the win, Callisthea. Take it. You don't care if he's alive. I care about closing a 3-month investigation with a result the Bureau can actually use. He said it plainly, without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. Your brother is one man. Moretti's organization has moved product through 6 countries. This is what the math looks like from where I'm sitting. She had known, in some clinical, distant way, that this moment might come. That the machine she'd volunteered to work inside had never actually cared about Evander the way she did. That to Cade, and everyone above him, her brother had always been a lever rather than a person. Knowing it and hearing it stated flat across a folding table were two very different things. "I need 48 hours," she said. "You have 24. The car goes in for service Thursday morning. If the package isn't planted by then, we lose the window for another 2 weeks, and the higher-ups are done waiting." She left the field office with her jaw set and her hands steady, walked 3 blocks in the wrong direction out of habit before she let herself stop and actually think. 24 hours, a fabricated trafficking charge against a man she now believed with a certainty that scared her more than the gunfire at the docks, had spent 4 million euros searching for her brother instead of ordering his death. A federal handler willing to let Evander die as collateral damage in a case that would look good in a quarterly report. She thought about the flash drive. Don't trust anyone above Ferrante's rank. Evander had never said, don't trust her own people. But he'd also never imagined his own sister's handler would be willing to sacrifice him for a conviction. By the time she reached the safe house 2 streets over, she'd already made the decision, and it terrified her exactly how easy it had been to make. She opened a secure line, not to Zephyrin, not yet, but to the encrypted channel she still technically owed her handler's loyalty through, and began feeding Cade's team a version of the truth engineered to buy time instead of destroy anyone. She reported that Moretti's vehicle rotation had changed, that the garage schedule she'd been given was outdated, that planting anything before verifying the new pattern risked exposing the entire operation for nothing. She reported movement toward the council members instead. Real intelligence, technically true, angled just enough to shift the Bureau's appetite away from a manufactured drug charge and toward the actual corruption Evander had died trying to expose. It was double agent work in the truest sense, and she knew it the second she sent the first transmission. She was no longer serving the task force that had trained her. She was serving the truth Evander had uncovered and protecting the man the Bureau wanted to destroy for the sake of a clean, closed file. If Cade ever traced the discrepancies back to her, it would end her career, her clearance, possibly her freedom. She sent the transmission anyway. Her phone buzzed 40 minutes later, not from Cade, but from Zephyrin, a single line with no context. Garage schedule changed on my end too. Somebody's watching the same car we are. She stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the shape of the war shift again beneath her feet. No longer her against Zephyrin, no longer even the council against Zephyrin, but something far larger and more tangled, with her own federal handlers now standing somewhere inside the blast radius. "Good," she typed back, "because I just burned my last clean bridge back to my own side to protect yours." The reply came almost instantly. "Then you'd better come home. We have a lot to plan, and considerably fewer people we can trust than we did this morning." The Zurich Express cut through the Alps at a speed that made the mountains blur into smears of white and green, and Callisthea had rarely appreciated stillness so much as she did in the private cabin Zephyrin had booked under a name that belonged to neither of them. 3 laptops were open across the small fold-down table, cables running between them in a configuration that would have looked, to anyone glancing in through the cabin door, like nothing more than 2 travelers working through an ordinary business trip. It was not ordinary. It was the first time since the wedding that Callisthea had let someone else see the full architecture of her real skill set. Not the disarming of gunmen at the docks, which had been instinct and adrenaline, but the slow, patient, technical work she'd trained for years to master. "Your handler's people traced the ransom-adjacent transfer to a shell in Zurich," Zephyrin said, watching her fingers move across the keyboard. "My people traced the same transfer 3 hops further, to a private courier network the Council's inner circle has used for over a decade." different pieces of the same trail. Callisthea pulled up a decryption window, federal-grade tools she technically had no authorization left to be running since she'd gone dark on her own task force. Your underworld network gets you access. Nobody legal ever could. My tools get me through encryption. Your contacts would need weeks to crack. Together, we might actually find him before Thursday. She looked up. He hadn't said it as a hope. He'd said it like a fact he intended to make true through sheer will, and something about the certainty in his voice settled a knot in her chest she hadn't realized was still there. They worked in a rhythm that surprised her, not the stiff, transactional partnership of two people who'd married for expedience and discovered a shared enemy, but something closer to the way she used to work alongside her best partners at the Bureau, before the Bureau had shown her exactly how disposable it considered the people she loved. Zephyrin fed her intercepted courier logs from contacts embedded in half the ports along the Mediterranean. She cross-referenced them against banking metadata and geolocation pings, narrowing a search radius that had once spanned 3 countries, down to a cluster of coordinates in the Swiss Alps, 40 kilometers from the border. There, she said, 3 hours in, tapping the screen, a repeating signal, low power, encrypted but sloppy. Someone's been pinging a satellite uplink from the same fixed location every 6 hours for the past 2 months. That's not courier traffic. That's a facility running on a schedule. Zephyrin leaned over her shoulder to look, close enough that she caught the faint smell of rain still clinging to his coat from Milan. A holding site. If it's him. She made herself say the caveat out loud, even though some quieter part of her had already stopped believing there was any other explanation. I don't want to promise you something I can't deliver. You haven't promised me anything since the docks. He said it without accusation, watching her rather than the screen now. You've just kept showing up and being right. She felt the compliment land somewhere unguarded, and it startled her, not because he'd said something kind, but because she realized she'd stopped bracing for the version of him she'd built in her head 3 months ago, the ruthless boss the Bureau's files had painted in flat, damning language. That man had never really existed, not the way she'd been told. What existed instead was someone who worked through the night beside her without complaint, who'd handed her a flash drive instead of a bullet, who looked at her now like she was something worth understanding rather than something to manage. You should know, Zephyrin said, after a long, quiet stretch broken only by the rhythm of the train, that I meant what I said before the wedding. The political shield, the arrangement the council forced on both of us. That was the truth then. And now? He didn't answer right away, and she found she didn't need him to. The way he was watching her said enough on its own, steady and unhurried, none of the careful political assessment from their vault wedding night left in it. Now I've watched you take down 2 armed men without breaking a sweat, burn your own career to protect mine, and stay awake 3 nights running trying to save a brother who isn't even mine. His voice dropped, quieter, more honest than she'd heard him since the study in Milan. The marriage started as a cage with your face on it, Callisthea. I don't see a cage anymore. She should have deflected. She'd spent months trained to redirect exactly this kind of moment, to keep every relationship inside an operation purely functional, because feelings were liabilities, and liabilities got people vanished. Instead, she found herself sitting very still, letting the words settle instead of parrying them, because some part of her, the part that had watched him kneel on his study floor holding her brother's watch like it mattered, had already stopped treating this as purely functional weeks ago. I didn't expect to respect you, she admitted. I built a whole plan around the assumption that I'd be dismantling your life from the inside. I didn't plan for you to be someone worth. She stopped, unwilling to finish the sentence with the word that had been circling for days. "Worth trusting," Zephyrin offered. "Worth more than that," she said, and let the admission sit between them, unresolved but no longer denied. Outside the window, the mountains rose sharper now, jagged white peaks cutting into a sky, gone the deep blue of early evening. Somewhere in that landscape, 40 kilometers from where the train would stop, a signal pinged every 6 hours from a fixed location that might hold her brother, and beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched over the glow of 3 laptop screens, sat a man she'd married to destroy and had somehow, impossibly, come to trust with everything that mattered. "We'll reach the coordinates by morning," she said, pulling her focus back to the screen, back to the work, because there would be time later for whatever this was becoming between them, but only if they survived what came next. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we go get him." The fortress rose out of the mountainside like something built to be forgotten, a converted hunting estate 3 generations old, stone walls thickened with a century of alpine winters, its windows dark except for a single lit room on the ground floor, and a faint blue glow from what Callisthea now knew, thanks to 11 hours of surveillance, was a server room powering the satellite uplink she'd traced from the train. They'd left the coordinates behind at dawn, swapped the Zurich Express for a rented 4-wheel drive that carried them up a switchback road no map wanted to acknowledge, and spent the better part of the day watching the estate from a ridge half a kilometer out, counting guards, timing patrol rotations, mapping the electrical grid that fed the whole compound from a single transformer station, 100 meters from the main gate. 6 visible on rotation, Zephyrin said, lowering the binoculars. Probably 4 more inside. Ferrante's people, not mine. I don't recognize a single face. Which means council money's paying for private muscle outside the family entirely. Callisthea kept her eyes on the transformer station, already building the shape of a plan in her head. That tracks. If Ferrante's the one who ordered the ambush at the docks, he wouldn't trust your own men to guard the thing he's most afraid of you finding. My missing lieutenant. Your missing lieutenant, she agreed, and didn't let herself say anything more hopeful than that, because hope had a way of making hands shake at exactly the wrong moment. The plan came together the way the best ones always did. Not elegant, not without risk, but built on the specific strengths of 2 people who'd spent the last 2 weeks learning to trust each other's instincts instead of second-guessing them. Zephyrin's men, 4 total, all hand-picked from the small circle he was still certain hadn't been compromised, would take the main gate at the changeover between patrol shifts, drawing the bulk of the guard force toward the front of the property. Callisthea would go in from the transformer station, cutting power to the compound's security systems and cameras from the outside, then move in alone through the service entrance she'd identified on the estate's original architectural blueprints, pulled, at no small risk, from a municipal records office Cade's team didn't know she'd accessed. Zephyrin would breach the holding cell itself, the moment the lights went dark and confusion bought them the 90 seconds they needed. "You should be with the extraction team," he said, one final time as they crouched in the tree line an hour before the shift change. "Not alone at a power station. I'm the only one who can drop that grid clean without tripping a backup generator." She checked the charge on the small device clipped to her belt, the same efficient calm settling over her that had carried her through the docks. "And you need to be the one who opens that door. If Evander's in there, he needs to see your face, not a stranger's. He needs to know you came for him." Zephyrin held her gaze a moment longer than the plan strictly required, and there was nothing left of the careful, political distance from their wedding night in the way he looked at her now. "Come back to me when this is done." "That's not a goodbye," she said. Don't make it sound like one. He didn't answer, but his hand found hers briefly in the dark. One hard squeeze before they split in opposite directions through the trees. The transformer station took less time than she'd estimated. 6 minutes of careful work, with tools that belonged more to her federal training than anything Zephyrin's underworld contacts had provided, cutting the estate's power in a cascading failure designed to look like an equipment fault rather than sabotage. The compound plunged into darkness. Somewhere near the main gate, she heard the first shouts of confusion, followed by controlled bursts of gunfire that told her Zephyrin's men had moved in exactly on schedule. She was through the service entrance 30 seconds later, moving fast and silent down a stone corridor lit only by the beam of her headlamp, following the layout she'd memorized from blueprints that were, God willing, still accurate. 2 guards came around a corner ahead of her, disoriented by the sudden dark, and she put them both down before either could raise an alarm. Quick, brutal, efficient. The same instinct that had taken over at the docks, now feeling less like a stranger's skill and more like simply herself. She found the control room exactly where the blueprints promised. A bank of monitors gone dark, with the power cut. Backup battery keeping just enough alive to show her the compound's internal camera feeds on manual override. And there, on a grainy black and white screen in the corner, a basement holding cell, a single figure seated against the far wall, head down, thinner than she remembered, but unmistakably, achingly her brother. Her breath caught. She didn't let herself stop moving. By the time she reached the basement level, Zephyrin was already there, having fought his way down through 2 guards of his own, blood on his knuckles and something fierce and unshakable in his face as he wrenched the cell door's manual lock apart, with a crowbar taken off one of the fallen men. The door gave. Evander looked up, bruised, gaunt, eyes hollow from 2 months in the dark, but alive, unmistakably alive, and the sound that came out of Callisthea when she saw his face clearly for the first time was not one she'd trained for, or planned, or ever imagined making in the field. Cal? Her brother's voice cracked on the single syllable, disbelief and relief tangled together. I'm here. She was on her knees beside him before she'd consciously decided to move, checking him for injuries, with hands that shook now. Finally, after weeks of forcing them steady. I'm here, Evan. We're getting you out. Zephyrin knelt on his other side, cutting through the zip ties binding Evander's wrists with quiet efficiency. And when Evander's eyes found him, found the man he'd once trusted enough to warn his own sister against, before circumstances proved that warning wrong, something passed between them that needed no explanation. You came, Evander rasped. Every day since you disappeared, Zephyrin said, helping him to his feet, bearing most of his weight, without hesitation. Let's go home, all 3 of us. Above them, the gunfire at the main gate was tapering off into silence, and somewhere in that silence, Callisthea allowed herself, for one unguarded moment, to believe the worst of this war might finally be behind them. The mountain chalet sat half a kilometer from the Swiss border, chosen for exactly that reason, close enough to slip across if things went wrong, isolated enough that a wounded man could rest without questions. Zephyrin's people had a doctor there within the hour, a quiet woman who didn't ask why her patient had 2 months of malnourishment and rope burns on his wrists, and by the time the sun came up over the peaks, Evander was clean, fed, and sleeping in a bed for the first time since his abduction. Callisthea hadn't left his side except to shower and change, and even then, she'd kept the door cracked, some part of her still refusing to believe he was actually safe until she'd watched him breathe undisturbed for hours running. You should rest too, Zephyrin said, finding her in the chalet's small kitchen just after dawn, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. He set one in front of her. "You've been awake for 2 days. I'll rest when I stop expecting to wake up and find out this was a dream." She wrapped both hands around the mug, grateful for the warmth. "Thank you. For the doctor. For all of it. You don't need to thank me for wanting the same thing you wanted." He sat across from her, and for a moment, just a moment, the chalet felt less like a war room and more like something almost ordinary. 2 people who'd fought together, who'd found what they were looking for, allowing themselves the smallest breath of peace before the next fight found them. It found them at 9:30. The first sign was the dog, Zephyrin's man Renzo, on watch at the tree line, radioing in a change in the wind that carried the wrong kind of quiet with it. The second was the black SUVs, 4 of them, materializing out of the fog on the access road with the kind of disciplined spacing that told Callisthea exactly what she was looking at before she'd even reached the window. Federal vehicles, her own people. "They tracked my burner," she said. Already moving, adrenaline cutting through 2 days of exhaustion in an instant. "I used it twice from here. I thought it was clean. I thought, how many?" Zephyrin was already at the gun cabinet, calm in the way he always went calm right before violence, methodical instead of panicked. "If it's a full extraction team, 12 to 16. Tactical gear, likely." She grabbed her own weapon off the counter, hands steady, despite the ice spreading through her chest. "Zephyrin, if this is a sanctioned op, they're not here for a conversation. They're here to arrest you and take Evander into federal custody, whether he wants to go or not." They didn't have time to argue about who to trust. The vehicles were already fanning out around the chalet's perimeter, and within 90 seconds, a voice through a bullhorn confirmed exactly what she'd feared. "Callisthea Reyes, this is Special Agent Colton Vassar. We have the property surrounded. Stand down and step outside with your hands visible. This does not need to end badly for you." Vassar, not Cade. Cade would have called her name differently. Softer, still trying to talk her back onto the right side of a line she'd already crossed. Vassar's voice carried none of that. It carried the flat, procedural certainty of a man executing an op he'd planned days in advance. "Vassar doesn't run field extractions," Callisthea murmured, working it through even as she moved to a defensible position near the chalet's rear entrance. "He's Cade's superior. Why is he here personally?" The answer arrived from an unexpected direction. Evander, awake now, pale and unsteady but on his feet, gripped the doorframe of the bedroom and said, in a voice still rough from disuse, "Because he's the one who sold me out." Both of them turned. I recognized his voice the second the bullhorn started, Evander said, forcing himself upright, refusing the hand Callisthea offered. "He was in the room, Cal. Twice. In the first weeks I was held. I didn't see his face. They kept me blindfolded most of the time. But I know that voice anywhere. He was giving orders to the council's men like he worked for them, like he'd worked for them a long time." The floor seemed to shift under Callisthea's feet. "Vassar is Bureau, Senior Field Command. He's been running interference on our whole task force for exactly as long as it took him to make sure nobody looked too hard at where the council's skimmed money was actually going." Zephyrin finished grimly, understanding arriving alongside her at the same terrible moment. "Your handler's chain of command has been compromised from above. That's why the trail always went cold. That's why the official bureau file called it a simple Mafia hit and closed the book on looking any further." Outside, Vassar's voice carried again through the bullhorn, patience thinning. "This is your last warning, Agent Reyes. We know Evander Reyes is inside. We know Zephyrin Moretti is with you. Federal jurisdiction applies. Stand down." Callisthea's mind raced through every angle at once. Surrendering meant handing her brother straight back into the hands of the man who'd overseen his imprisonment, dressed up in the legitimacy of a federal badge. Fighting meant firing on her own government's agents, an act with no clean way back from it. And somewhere behind Vassar's black SUVs, she had no doubt, sat a direct line to Ferrante's council faction, coordinating with the very federal officer who was supposed to be investigating them. "We can't surrender," Evander said, reading the calculation on her face. "Cal, if he gets me back into federal custody, there's no case, no trial, no due process. There's just a rogue officer, finishing what the council started. I know." She looked at Zephyrin, and something passed between them that needed no more words than it had at the docks. "And we can't win a firefight against 16 federal agents either." "Then we don't fight them here," Zephyrin said, already moving toward the chalet's rear exit, toward the tree line and the escape route his men had scouted the moment they'd chosen this location. "We run. And once we're clear, we find a way to bring this straight to your bureau's front door, with enough proof that even a compromised chain of command can't bury it." Callisthea grabbed her brother's arm, steadying him, pulling him toward the door as the first federal agents began advancing through the fog outside. "The law can't protect us," she said, more to herself than either of them, the last fragile piece of the world she'd trusted before this began finally, completely, falling away. "The council can't be trusted. It's just us now, Evan. It was always going to come down to just us." The Grand Council Hall hadn't seen an unscheduled arrival in over 60 years, which was precisely why the 12 men seated around its ancient stone table never heard the doors open until they'd already swung wide. Zephyrin walked in first, still carrying the bruises of the mountain extraction, still moving with the controlled fury of a man who'd spent 3 months being quietly accused of a crime he never committed. Callisthea flanked his left, dressed not in the soft, forgettable clothes of the bride the council had once dismissed as harmless, but in dark tactical gear that made every man at that table sit up straighter. And on Zephyrin's right, thinner than he should have been but standing without help, walked Evander. A dead man, by every account the council had spent 3 months believing, returned to the one room in Sicily where his resurrection would land like a bomb. Don Ferrante's cane clattered against the stone floor as he rose halfway out of his chair before catching himself. "This meeting is closed to—" "It's closing early," Zephyrin said, "for everyone who isn't about to be arrested." The 3 weeks since the border ambush had been the most dangerous of Callisthea's life. A slow, careful campaign of building an unimpeachable case while evading both the council's remaining assassins and the compromised federal chain of command that answered, ultimately, to a man named Vassar. She'd spent those weeks doing the work she'd been trained for and had never once gotten to do inside a legitimate framework, cross-referencing Zephyrin's underworld financial intelligence against the Bureau's own internal audit logs, building a case so airtight that even a corrupted agency couldn't quietly bury it without exposing themselves in the process. Cade had come through, in the end, once she'd laid the full picture in front of him, the skimmed accounts, Evander's testimony naming Vassar's voice from his captivity, the docked ambush, and the border raid both traced back to the same rogue faction. He'd made the only choice a man with any remaining integrity could make. He'd taken it over Vassar's head, straight to the Bureau's Inspector General, and Vassar had been arrested 48 hours ago in a raid that made national news for reasons nobody outside this room yet understood. Now it was the council's turn. Callisthea set a tablet on the ancient stone table, its screen glowing with the digital evidence they'd spent weeks compiling. 3 of you, she said, meeting the eyes of the men Evander had identified from ledgers, voice recordings, and shipping manifests that no longer had any innocent explanation, have been skimming profits from every operation this family runs for the better part of 2 years. When Evander Reyes discovered it, you didn't bring it to a vote. You had him abducted, held for 2 months in an alpine facility, funded through 4 layers of shell accounts, and when your boss started spending his own fortune trying to find him, you tried to have Zephyrin finished at the Genoa docks rather than risk him uncovering the truth. Lies, one of the accused men snapped. Consigliere Renata Volpe, a woman who'd sat on this council longer than Zephyrin had been alive. Fabrications built by a federal informant this family should never have let through its doors. The federal informant, Callisthea said evenly, is the reason your co-conspirator Agent Vassar is currently in a holding cell answering for his role in your operation. Would you like to explain to the rest of this table how deep that particular corruption runs? Or should I? Silence. Volpe's face had gone the color of old parchment. Zephyrin stepped forward, placing both hands flat on the stone table, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had spent 3 months being quietly poisoned in the eyes of his own family and had finally, completely, run out of patience for it. For 3 months, every man in this room let a story stand that I finished my own lieutenant. Some of you believed it, because it was easier than questioning your own leadership. Some of you, his eyes moved deliberately, to Ferrante, to Volpe, to a third man seated between them, whose name Callisthea had confirmed only 2 days earlier, helped write it, because the truth would have ended you. Ferrante found his voice again, though it shook now, all its former authority drained out of it. You have no proof that I have your voice, recorded through Evander's own testimony, giving orders inside that alpine facility. Zephyrin's tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. I have banking records showing your personal accounts receiving transfers within days of every skimmed shipment. I have the ambush at the docks, coordinated with the same triangulated tactics your private security contractor has used on 3 separate occasions this council has quietly funded. This isn't a trial, Ferrante. There's nothing left to try. This is a reckoning. The council chamber, which had governed this family's affairs through wars, successions, and betrayals stretching back generations, sat in absolute silence as the full weight of what was happening settled over it. By the law, this family has followed for 100 years, Zephyrin continued. A council member who conspires against their own boss forfeits their seat, their protection, and their place in this family entirely. I am invoking that law tonight against all 3 of you, effective immediately. 2 of Zephyrin's most trusted men, the same ones who'd stood beside him at the fortress in the Alps, moved to flank the accused, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, Callisthea watched the fear that had haunted her for 3 months finally transfer fully onto the faces of the men who deserved to carry it. Ferrante's cane hit the floor as he was escorted from the chamber. Volpe went silently, jaw locked, eyes burning with a hatred she no longer had any power to act on. The third conspirator didn't even manage that much composure, sagging between the 2 guards like something already broken. When the doors closed behind them, Zephyrin turned to face the remaining council members, men who now understood, with total clarity, exactly what happened to anyone who mistook his patience for weakness. Evander Reyes, he said, gesturing to the man standing straighter with every passing minute, color returning to his face for the first time in months, will sit at this table as my second, effective tonight. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to follow Ferrante out the door. No one moved. No one spoke. Callisthea watched her brother take his place at the table their enemies had just been dragged from, watched Zephyrin claim, in front of the last men who might have challenged him, an authority no one in that room would ever question again, and felt, for the first time since a cathedral vault 3 months ago, that the war might actually be over. 4 weeks later, Capri looked like a place that had never heard of war. The cliffside villa Zephyrin had inherited from his grandfather sat above turquoise water, so clear it seemed lit from beneath, and for the first time since a defrocked priest had mumbled through vows neither of them meant, Callisthea woke up without immediately cataloging exits. Evander had settled into his new role faster than she'd expected, thinner still than before his captivity, but sharp again, running the family's now legitimate logistics operations with the same meticulous care that had gotten him nearly ended for finding the truth in the first place. He'd taken an apartment 2 floors below the council's cleaned-out chamber, close enough to Zephyrin's authority to be useful, far enough to build something that was his own, which left Callisthea standing on a helipad at dawn with a packed bag, watching the sea, trying to convince herself that leaving was the responsible thing to do. It made sense. On paper. The Bureau's Inspector General had quietly closed her file 2 weeks ago. Vassar's arrest and the subsequent purge of the compromised chain of command had made her original mission, in the strictest sense, obsolete. Cade had told her, not unkindly, that she'd more than earned an honorable exit if she wanted one. Evander was safe. The council's corruption had been dealt with, publicly and permanently. Zephyrin's empire, whatever it was becoming under his rebuilt leadership, no longer needed a federal agent's cover story, or a wife bound to him by council law. The marriage had done its job. She told herself that 3 times on the walk to the helipad, and it still didn't feel true. You weren't going to say goodbye. She turned. Zephyrin stood at the edge of the terrace in the pale gold light, a folder in one hand, and something in his expression stopped her cold before he'd said another word. Not anger, not the careful political assessment from their wedding night. Something rawer than either. I thought it would be easier, she admitted, for both of us. Easier how? He crossed the terrace toward her, unhurried, the way he'd learned to move around her over the last 4 months. Never crowding, always leaving room for her to close the distance herself, if she chose to. You think I don't know exactly what you're doing right now? I think my job here is finished. She kept her voice steady, the same steadiness she'd used to survive a cathedral vault full of armed men, a docks ambush, an Alpine extraction, a federal betrayal. It had never once failed her. It nearly failed her now. Evander's safe. The council's clean. You don't need a wife the law forced on you anymore. That's the story you built the whole cover on. Zephyrin stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to meet his eyes. It was never true, and you know it. Not after the docks. Not after the flash drive, or the train, or the night you burned your own career, rather than let my car get planted with evidence that would have ended me. Zephyrin, let me finish. He held up the folder, and she recognized the papers inside before he even opened it. The shredded remains of her federal resignation forms. The ones she'd drafted 3 days ago in a moment of private, exhausted clarity and thrown away without ever intending to file. He must have pulled them straight out of the trash. I found these. I want you to know that before I say anything else, because I need you to understand, I'm not asking you to give something up for me. You'd already decided to. She stared at the torn paper, throat tight. I told myself I was keeping options open. You were done deciding the moment you chose to fight beside me, instead of walking away at the border. He set the folder down on the terrace railing between them and pulled out something else instead. A single document, bound, official, drafted with a care that told her this wasn't something he'd thrown together overnight. This isn't a council marriage contract. There's no law forcing either of us into anything anymore. Ferrante's gone. Nobody in that chamber can compel you to stay married to me for one more day if that's not what you want. Then what is it? A partnership. He handed it to her, and she scanned the terms with hands that had gone unsteady for the first time in weeks. Full joint authority over the family's operations. Her name listed beside his on every account, every holding, every decision that mattered, not as a political shield, but as an equal. You built this cover to destroy me, Callisthea. Instead, you saved my life twice, found your brother when I couldn't, exposed a betrayal that would have buried this family within a year, and did it all while carrying more weight than any one person should have to. I don't want a wife the council forced on me. I never really did, even that first night. I want a partner I chose. The helicopter's rotors sat silent behind her, the bag still slung over one shoulder, the version of her morning where she quietly disappeared, back into a life without him, already dissolving in the salt air. I wasn't leaving because I didn't want this, she said finally, the admission costing her something she'd guarded carefully since a wedding vault 3 months ago. I was leaving because I didn't think I was allowed to want it. Everything between us started as a lie. It didn't stay one. He reached out, tucked a strand of hair back from her face with the same surprising gentleness he'd shown, sliding a ring onto her finger the night everything began. You've never once, in 4 months, been a lie to me. I watched you burn every safe exit you had, rather than let me fall. That's not a cover story, Callisthea. That's the truest thing I've ever seen anyone do. She set the bag down. Let it fall. Then I suppose, she said, closing the distance between them at last. No performance left to hide behind. No cage, no rings hiding anything but exactly what they were. The real wedding finally starts now. Zephyrin smiled, actually smiled, unguarded, the way she'd never once seen him do in a room full of councilmen, and pulled her into him like a man who had no intention of ever again letting her walk toward a helicopter alone. Below them, the Mediterranean stretched out gold and endless, and for the first time since a cathedral vault had swallowed her into a marriage built on lies, Callisthea Reyes stood at the center of something entirely, undeniably true.